Hello and welcome. I am Malicious, welcome back to my channel. I love Lord of the Rings, I love Tolkien's work, and I love MMORPGs. And with that, I've decided that this video will be entirely about the second age of the Middle-earth and what you can expect or anticipate when deciding whether or not to play the upcoming Amazon/Athlon MMORPG that's on the way soon. I've decided to keep a lot of the random lore stuff out, but I've made this as beginner friendly as possible to anyone who is interested in the universe and needs an introduction into what to expect and the lore. There will be spoilers to the story everywhere in this video, but we will discuss what sort of battles and storylines would be interesting to either watch on the series or play through the games. Bear in mind, there are many wonderful videos out there about the entire history of the Second Age. I've broken this video up into sections. First, a general overview of how the world was created. It's very brief. Secondly, the races into Middle-earth pertaining to the Second Age and what could possibly be in the game, followed by the history and major events, and then getting into some theories of PvP, story and progression, visuals, and PvE that could be in the game. So, without much further ado, I'd like to thank you for being here and watching this video. I'm sorry for the long-winded intro, but let's get into it. So, in the beginning, Eru Ilúvatar created the Ainur. I won't go into full detail on how the world was created, but the important thing to know is that the Ainur eventually became the Valar and Maiar. The Valar being gods with a lowercase g, and Eru Ilúvatar being god with a capital G, meaning that Eru is the creator of the other gods and the supreme creator, the one above the Valar. The Maiar are in the same spirit class as the Valar, however they are much less powerful, and this is why there is a differentiation between them. For example, Sauron, Gandalf, and Saruman are all Maiar spirits. Also, the Balrogs of Morgoth are corrupted Maiar. Think of them as angels and the Valar as a pantheon of gods that serve under the one god, Eru Ilúvatar. So, Morgoth, or as he was known in the past as Melkor, which is his true name, was also one of the most powerful Ainur and would likely be counted as a Valar or general god within the universe. However, he is no longer counted as such, because of course he was the first Dark Lord, Sauron being the second Dark Lord and his lieutenant. So now that you have a brief understanding of what the Valar, the Maiar, Sauron, and Melkor are, I'll go into some of the races and then the real meat and bones of the situation of what went down in the Second Age. I will be leaving a lot of stuff out that's not really super relevant to an MMORPG setting, however, and keeping it as beginner friendly as I possibly can. So I'd like to move on here and talk about the races. Before we fully get into the races and what they are, I have to establish that the wizards, for example, are Maiar spirits in human-like form. They are known in the Elvish language of Quenya as the Istari. They were sent by the Valar to assist the peoples of Middle-earth, and as far as I know there are only 5 wizards: Saruman the White, Gandalf the Grey, Radagast the Brown, and the 2 blue wizards. Another thing to bear in mind is that these wizards were servants of some of the Valar. For example, Saruman was a servant of the Valar Aule. So each had their own sort of allegiance, but that's not super important for now. The likelihood of being able to play a wizard in this MMO I would assume is a 50-50. Lore-wise, if there's only 5 of them, and they seem to have only really arrived during the Third Age, most of them anyways, so it's quite unlikely. However, for magic lovers, there are other elements of magic within Middle-earth. So even if you can't play a wizard, they may implement a class that focuses on magic, like Lore Master from Lord of the Rings Online. I do wonder, however, how lore-friendly they will keep the MMO and how many creative liberties they will take. Next up, Balrogs, the corrupt Maiar spirits. They were corrupted by Morgoth or Melkor long ago. Now, most of the Balrogs were destroyed during the First Age. Most of you will know about Durin's Bane, which was the Balrog in Moria during the Third Age, so it's likely some of them survived. They could bring a Balrog or 2 within the Second Age with some creative freedom, however it's unlikely we will see many of them. However, if this was the First Age, there would be a lot more to do with them in the first place. I'd love to see a Middle-earth MMORPG that would focus all the ages of Middle-earth into one focused game. However, Tolkien spent so long creating thousands of years of story, lore, and characters that it would be unfeasible. Onward to the dwarves. Now, the dwarves are great craftsmen, and mostly lived in beautiful mountains or caves where they designed and created some wonders. Moria, for example. Erebor if you've watched The Hobbit. But there are other places they dwelled also. The Iron Hills, the Blue Mountains, and such. There are a lot of game design mechanics that can revolve around the dwarven race, especially in the Second Age. I'd love to see some crafting based things here due to the sheer amount of dwarven smithing, things like mithril and such, but let's not forget that elves were also talented and skilled craftsmen, which brings me perfectly to the point of elves. When we come to elves, the first thing to understand is that they were technically the firstborn children of the world, and first to awaken in Middle-earth. They are blessed with eternal life, wisdom, intelligence, understanding of speech and song like no other, agility, skills, and many more wonderful traits. They are often always around the action of Middle-earth. There are many different kinds of elves, and if we go back to the First Age, there's even more to discuss. But if we stick to the Second Age, the three groups that mostly formed were the Noldor elves, Vanyar elves, and Teleri. There's more stuff to that, of course, for example the Sylvan elves or Wood elves, but none of that is relevant for now. Now the race of men. Now there are many men of Middle-earth, depending on which part you go to. The Edain and Dunedain were rewarded because of their deeds during the First Age and standing against Morgoth in that great battle. They were granted an island known as Numenor, which is a very important island within the Second Age. They were also granted longer life, greater health, advanced strength, fairer features, and many other things. Basically, they were granted a human upgrade package. There are many other kinds of humans, including Easterlings that fought for Sauron during the Third Age. There's also the Northmen and many others, but there will be plenty of human opportunities here. I however foresee a large part of the story being focused on Numenor for sure. It's pretty much guaranteed that Numenor is going to be a big part of the TV series. How much of it is going to be in the game is also probably going to be a large part. For some reason, I've decided to include the tree-like shepherds of the forest, the Ents. They are quite ancient. Don't think Ents will be a playable race. They may have some significance within the game, but that's probably due to creative liberties. Now, concerning hobbits, small folk, they live in their own areas of the Shire and such. They will likely not play a big role within the Second Age, at least canonically. However, due to how much people actually like hobbits, there is a chance for creative liberties to be taken here and for hobbits to show up one way or another. I've no clue if they will be playable like the burglar class in Lord of the Rings Online, and they can take creative liberties. However, the First and Second Age, in my opinion, focus more on men and elves. Tragic and interesting tales where honestly I don't think hobbits would belong within a large part of the story. In fact, they can show up and be some NPCs you talk to do certain things, perhaps some sort of trade with hobbit settlements, but even the Shire that we know and love today wasn't built or founded till the Third Age. The lore-friendly answer is likely that hobbits may not make it in as much, at least not in anything major or playable during the Second Age, and honestly, I wouldn't want them to. We move here to the servants of Morgoth and Sauron. Now here's the interesting part. Orcs were corrupted beings. The widespread theory is that orcs were corrupted elves, since in Tolkien's works, evil cannot create life, only corrupt and twist it. There are many theories to back this up, but as we know, Tolkien kept changing and amending quite a few things as he went along. Orcs will likely be the main enemy. Will they be playable, however? I find that unlikely, unless the game is based on a faction system that allows players to choose between the side of good and evil. Or it may be adapted like Lord of the Rings Online was during PvP, where players can decide what side they want to be on, but during PvE they don't really have a choice there. So, the next race.
They have a cave troll.
There are many kinds of trolls. cave trolls, hill trolls, mountain trolls and such. Sadly, Ologhai, which is a race bred by Sauron during the Third Age that classify as a more intelligent type of troll hybrid thing, will most likely not appear, since we are focused on the Second Age here. Trolls aren't known for intelligence, but they are known for durability and strength and such. They have weaknesses, some of them turning to complete stone once hit by sunlight. Once again, if they are playable, it will likely be in the same way orcs are. I think a faction system would be highly interesting and make the world really come alive. If the entirety of Sauron's forces are NPC based, then it will likely feel a lot more story based, and PvP will probably be quite different in the game due to how the world is balanced in the good versus evil sense. The other races that will show up are less likely to be important and have a 50-50 chance of appearing in the first place. Things like giants, dragons, spiders, spirits of old, the great blessed beasts, the wicked beasts. The lore is very deep and interesting, but it's good to bear in mind that even though, for example, nothing in the Second Age about dragons was written specifically, there are technically still dragons around during this time. Creative freedom, a few dragons, let's be honest, it's likely to happen at least once. If the option is there, usually someone will take it. Now that we've got the races and the most basic explanations out of the way, let's move on to some of the history of the Second Age and some more significant battles, stories, or adventures that you, the player, will be able to experience firsthand during this MMORPG, most likely anyway. First, I'll break it down into big possible storylines and plot lines in chronological order. The Second Age started after the defeat of Morgoth, which devastated Middle-earth. We begin the adventure of the Second Age with the founding of Lindon. The Noldor elves founded the kingdom of Lindon under the High King Gil-galad. Some elves adventured further and settled in places like Lothlorien, the Woodland Realm, and a few other scattered areas of Middle-earth. For reasons of kingship and other small things, the Noldor being high elves of course, some that preferred self-governing met and ruled over the Sylvan elves in Lothlorien and other places. Some of the more notable elves that were around during this time are Elrond, Thranduil, Galadriel, Celeborn. I only mention these few since they are definitely involved and are some of the more known elves via the media of the movies. We move on here to the founding of Numenor in year 32 of the Second Age. Numenor is an interesting place, since the Edain were rewarded and known to many other races as the Dunedain. They were founded and led by Elros, who was the half-elven brother of a certain elf we all know and love, Elrond. Elros gave up his immortality to become a mortal man who lived a long life and spawned from him a line of kings of Numenor. Interesting to know, Dunedain also means men of the West. We take a visit to the dwarves here. In the year 40 of the Second Age, the dwarves of certain clans like the Firebeards and a few others migrated and joined Durin's folk in Khazad-dûm around the Misty Mountains, migrating away from their old dwellings in places like the Blue Mountains. Now, after a few hundred years, back at the island of Numenor, the Numenorians began journeying to Middle-earth from their island, seeking to sail and spread their influence and knowledge. Some of them settling in Middle-earth as their power and influence grew, to avoid a large number of spoilers and give you everything that happened, since there were many political and interesting events over the hundreds of years that had passed that happened in Numenor, many of which will likely make it into the game, but the main takeaway here is that over the years the line of kings split, because it would be a long time before women were allowed to rule. So a new house and title were created, known as the Lords of Andúnir. The Lords of Andúnir will definitely be an important house, especially in the future. Later on, however, some elves heard of the discovery of Mithril by the dwarves, and a very special elf by the name of Celebrimbor and his people would move there and strike up a great friendship with dwarves while founding the realm of Eregion. The realm of Eregion would be ruled by Galadriel and Celeborn and later passed to Celebrimbor once they had moved on. Now bear in mind, the Noldor elves, especially Celebrimbor and his predecessors that I will not name, were incredible craftsmen. Celebrimbor is very important here for many reasons we'll get into later. This is around the same time Galadriel and Celeborn would dwell in a new capital city created here called Ostinethil. These times of trade and peace did not last for too long, however. A shadow in the east became aware of the growing power and influence of Numenor. The Dark Lord Sauron began the construction of Barad-dûr in the east, strengthening and fortifying his power. However, not everyone was blind to this. Some knew of his existence and had been keeping tabs. The High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, for example. This would be the end of the first millennium of the Second Age. This age did indeed span for 3,441 years, so there's a lot more to come. Toward the start of the second millennium, the Dark Lord Sauron began putting his plan into motion. The same plan that brought us Lord of the Rings. Many of you know Sauron as the armed destroyer from the movies most likely. Not many know that he could take fair form. Sauron disguised himself as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, posing as an emissary of the Valar. Anatar began trying to befriend the elves, however Elrond and Gil-galad did not trust him and turned him away. This was around the same time Númenóreans began to settle in Middle-earth instead of voyaging. Later on, however, Anatar was accepted by the elves of Eregion, Celebrimbor's people, and there he began to put everything into motion. Anatar taught Celebrimbor and his people the way of creating the Rings of Power. 7 rings went to the dwarves. 9 rings were gifted to the race of men, but in secret, while Anatar was gone, Celebrimbor used his teachings to forge 3 more rings, the secret elven Rings of Power, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya. I won't discuss the powers of each of these rings for the moment. Although these rings were untainted by Sauron's corruption, they were still susceptible to the power of the one ring that Sauron would create not far from the creation of the Rings of Power, for they were made through his teachings. When the one ring was forged and Sauron placed it upon his finger, the elves became aware of his deception and his true intentions, and thus took off the rings and sent them far away in the hands of Galadriel, Círdan, and Gil-galad, some of the wisest and most powerful elves of the time. With Sauron's plans revealed, he had no choice at this point but to come out of the shadows, declare himself openly, and prepare for the war to come. I want to say here that even though early Ice Age wizards arrived around the Third Age, 2 blue wizards that have been quite mysterious in Tolkien's works arrived during this time, according to later texts, called the Peoples of Middle-earth. Their mission was weakening Sauron's hold on the east and diminishing his growing power. Also around this time, one of the mightiest elves, and someone I really hope to see, known as Glorfindel, returned to Middle-earth also. Not long after this, with a few events in between, the War of the Elves and Sauron began. Eregion was invaded. Great battles and sieges were fought between the elves and Sauron. Celebrimbor was tortured for the location of the Rings of Power and eventually killed. Although he gave away the location of the Dwarven Rings and the Rings of Men, he did not reveal any information about the Elven Rings. With Celebrimbor gone, Eregion sacked, and Gil-galad and Elrond's forces being threatened by Sauron's armies, aid came in the form of the Númenóreans that received Gil-galad's message about Sauron. The dwarves of Khazad-dûm helped the refugees of Eregion, letting them pass through, but also coming out of their mountain holes to battle against parts of Sauron's armies, assaulting them from behind. While the Númenóreans and the elves fought together to push Sauron back and out of Eriador. During this time, Elrond founded Imladris, or Rivendell, a new city and stronghold of the elves, after the fall of Eregion, and was given the ring Vilya by Gil-galad, who still had the untainted Ring of Power in his possession. For a time there was a long peace. The Númenóreans came and went into Middle-earth, slowly settling and spreading their influence as time went on, sailing from their main island that was to the west to the mainland of Middle-earth and back, with great naval forces and increasing power. However, a few hundred years later down the line, there were splits and signs of corruption within Numenor. Many feared death and hated how the elves could live forever, yet they were not given the same. Internal strife and politics, differences of opinions, good kings and bad ones came and went. The days of giving thanks and love to Eru Ilúvatar were gone during this time in Numenor. However, the lords of Andúnië remained faithful and separated themselves from the main line of kings, keeping the customs and knowledge of old, even in secret, as after a while these faithful, as they were known, became more and more persecuted and hated by the rest of the Númenóreans. There's a long history here that resulted in rebellion and civil war, another battle I hope to see within the MMORPG. A way to create a divide between the people and promote player versus player combat. But back to Numenor. Sauron would emerge again and call himself the King of Men. By this time many men had already been corrupted, and the Nazgûl had emerged, more than 500 years before this. The Númenóreans launched an attack against Sauron, however, Sauron would surrender to them and be taken as prisoner. But Sauron did what he does best, under the disguise of Annatar. Over the years he seduced the Númenóreans to evil, corrupting and whispering, and over the years as his power grew he became the most trusted advisor of the king. The seeds of evil he sowed and nurtured grew right to the downfall of Numenor, for he advised the king to take his armies to Valinor, to take immortality for themselves, the land of the Valar. Even though the Númenóreans were warned to turn back, to not sail to the Undying Lands, the lands in which the Valar and elves dwelled, as it was not the destiny of men. In fact, men had a different destiny, after death. One Eru Ilúvatar did not tell them or make clear. However, Sauron got his wish. Many Númenóreans died, and Eru himself brought down the island of Numenor and reshaped the world, wiping the island from existence and all who remained on it, including Sauron. This would mark the last time Sauron would ever be able to take fair form, as his physical body was destroyed, but his spirit endured. With the One Ring, he went back to Mordor and became the Sauron that was clad in that beautiful but fear-inspiring armor. Although he had lost his body, he gained his revenge. The survivors of Numenor were Elendil and his sons Isildur and Anarion, and the other Númenóreans that brought with them many artifacts and heirlooms of their family and home. Not long after, the kingdom of Arnor and the kingdom of Gondor were formed. Sauron, catching wind of this, was enraged and began his attacks upon Gondor. After King Elendil learned of these attacks, knowing that his sons were in danger and being attacked, King Elendil went to the High King Gil-galad, and this is where the last alliance of elves and men was forged. Soon after, the dwarves of Durin's folk joined also. The biggest battle of the Second Age for certain, truly a sight to behold, where many of the most known people of Middle-earth, even the beasts of Middle-earth, the eagles for example. A battle with such a grand and beautiful scale that I would live and die happily if I were to ever witness this or experience this done well in an MMORPG. Many casualties happened during this battle, including notable kings like King Oropher, Thranduil's father, and Legolas's grandfather, as well as the countless bodies you see in the places later known as the Dead Marshes. They sieged Sauron for 7 years, even though the forces of Sauron had an impressive defense and managed to slay Anarion during the siege. There came a time for Sauron to finally show himself and face his enemies head-on. The rest from here is history. King Elendil and High King Gil-galad fought Sauron toe-to-toe and gave their lives during the fight. Isildur, the last surviving heir of Elendil, losing both his brother and father, picked up the shards of the shattered sword Narsil and cut the One Ring of power from Sauron's finger, destroying his body. The battle was finally over. The Dark Lord was defeated once again. But as we know, Isildur did not destroy the ring, but rather kept it. The allure of its power and corruption, and the rage and grief of losing both his brother and father, convincing him he deserved to keep it. After this, many elves decided to leave since their High King Gil-galad was slain in battle. They left Middle-earth, going back to the Undying Lands where the Valar dwelled. So, with that, the Second Age came to an end, and the Third Age began. Now, that was a lot to follow, I know, but I did my best to make it as beginner-friendly as possible and easier to pick up and understand. Hopefully the visuals on the screen assisted with that. If there is anything unclear, or more you'd like to know, let me know in the comments and I can either make a new video or leave comments back. But for now, there's more content to cover, the theory part of things. Bear in mind all of this comes from my personal opinions, thoughts, theories, and speculations about what could happen or what should happen in my opinion. I'd like to begin with the PvP section. So I've played a lot of MMORPGs with so many different PvP systems and faction-based systems that worked out really well. For example, a game like World of Warcraft has extensive lore and faction-on-faction violence, less throughout the years obviously, and mostly story-driven. But in games like Aeon, Arcade, or Elyon, the faction divide is there entirely to promote PvP. Often the average player there doesn't really care about the lore and it's just basically another way to say that red is dead. However, in Lord of the Rings, especially the way everything is written, tales, lore, stories and all of that, we never really get as much detail about orcs or trolls as much as we do humans and elves. Because from the start of the story, you aren't really given much of an option to root for Sauron or any other random nameless orc. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I am saying it's very clear that it's a good versus evil-like universe, unlike the ambiguity that exists in, as I stated, things like Arcade, Aeon, WoW, etc. In these games you have a whole different set of freedom to choose between different factions and things that aren't inherently good or evil. Although I should mention Tolkien never made anything irredeemable. The real question is, as competent video game developers, they should be able to make a faction system feasible, if they really put the work in. But as I said about Tolkien's works, and how other people have handled things like that, for example Lord of the Rings Online, which has a monster play system where you can make an orc or something else from, the armies of Mordor and those kinds of beasts, and PvP, but you can't really make it a character you adventure the world with. So what's the answer here? Even though having players running around as orcs is fun for the world environment, I wouldn't say it would be healthy for the state of the game. The likelihood of things is that most people will elect to play elves or humans. Now, if the game developers decided to make large battles within the story a sort of PvP fiesta mode, where players can become orcs, trolls, and such, temporarily even, in some sort of instance battleground, that would be interesting. But when it comes to open world PvP, I would assume the lore would either have to be something along the lines of having outlaws or smaller internal faction struggles that actually go into the story. For example, the divide between the faithful Númenóreans and other Númenóreans that decided to invade the Undying Lands. Or remember, the Easterlings were disconnected and complete enemies of the Elves and Númenóreans. There's other tribes like the Northmen, the Wood Elves. Deep dives into the lore could open the way for conflict within these regions. If we look at Amazon Studios, they made New World a game heavily based around PvP, but then sort of changed their minds. They are constantly changing that game, and if we use that game as a base for what kind of game they can or will create, then we're likely in trouble. I honestly would love for a completely different and flashier combat system than the one in New World, and I'm cautiously optimistic. I know that there are other developers involved in this game, and it's likely that they will pull out all the stops to make the new Lord of the Rings MMO something special, because honestly it could be one of the largest MMORPGs to come out in recent times for several reasons. Lord of the Rings and Tolkien fans everywhere will take notice, firstly. Secondly, the MMORPG market seems to be missing quite a few elements these days, and competition is at a low. So, no real new releases have really made a dent in the industry for a few years now, a good few years. And thirdly, the company behind it. Amazon has the ability to fund something extraordinary, and I'm hoping they do that. If Final Fantasy, Elder Scrolls Online, and other games can extend their reach within the MMORPG world, then I don't see how this would be any different. I'm expecting nothing less than AAA standard detail and efforts here. There's also a chance that PvP isn't necessarily going to be around that much, which would be a shame. I've always been a PvP lover. They could make this game almost entirely story and lore based, and it would still be a good game. Comparisons to this would be Final Fantasy XIV. It feels much more like a community and PvE based MMORPG with some small elements of instance PvP, but it's never really a focus of the game. There's so many big challenges when it comes to this game. For example, how do they plan to cram 3,441 years of history into a single game? At what point of that game will they start? Like, where in the timeline do they begin? Will PvP even be available within the game? We have so many questions as a community, and honestly I'm gonna do my best to get all the answers I possibly can, because I'm genuinely excited for this game. It's like a dream come true for me, if done correctly. But being correct in the MMORPG world can be highly subjective at times, because as we know, one person's fantasy rarely aligns perfectly with another's, and creative liberties are sure to be taken here. How much liberties and changes they will make, however, we will only know with time. I think in the story and progression department, a great idea would be making major events unfold over time. Either weekly events and updates that change with time so the world feels living and breathing, something that's rarely done well in MMORPGs, or a system like World of Warcraft where the entire game changes with each patch one way or another. It would be interesting to see at the start of the game, you start as a Numenorian, you sail to the mainland, coming back, different quests, different missions, whole different game plan. Only for the entire island of Numenor to be wiped off the map during an event 2 or 3 expansions down the line. I think playing out the story and adventures, really getting involved in a large, vast world with a combination of naval travel, great combat, story, lore, and interesting explorable areas would really captivate the essence of a good MMORPG. And who knows, old mechanics like traveling into dark wildernesses like areas where lawlessness is a thing that could influence the game. All of this is speculation, of course, but I think it's my personal duty to get information, support, and free-flowing ideas out there while the game is still being developed, so the developers can draw from or listen to the consumers that care about Tolkien's works and those who care about authenticity and creativity. The visuals are going to be important. Let's not forget the world of Middle-earth is genuinely an awe-inspiring landscape. If you've seen the movies, read the books, or even seen some of the art, you'd be able to grasp how the imagery and beauty is really inspired by Tolkien's writings. From the mines of Moria to the elvish havens and the beauties of Imladris or Rivendell, as it is commonly known. The cities, even the places void of life, have a will and story of their own. I think this is also something super important when it comes to the game. Bland or mundane looking areas can work, certain amounts of games can really make that work. But to truly captivate, the beauty and essence of Tolkien's work would require high amounts of care and detail. To say that the Second Age MMORPG is an ambitious project is probably short of the truth. Highly ambitious is more likely. So, PvE is going to be an important element, clearly. Dungeons, grinding and such are always found in MMORPGs. My worry here is that, for example, the Mines of Moria are safe in the Second Age. There's no Balrog to fight there. Barad-dûr doesn't get built for 1,000 years since the start of the Second Age. So when it comes to dungeons and raids, creative liberties and cool mechanics are going to be essential. I can already see some of the fights I talked about being epic fights, continuous campaigns, or broken up into dungeons and raids, for example. If we take the largest battle of the Second Age, the siege that lasted 7 years at the end of the age versus Sauron, that could be taken and broken down into several dungeons or raids that appear over time, or world events that take time to show up, different battles in different regions or parts of that alliance. The possibilities are endless. You could even extend those to full-on WoW-like expansions with interim stories and scattered bits of lore everywhere that are taken up. The sacking of a Region, for example, you could mount a chaotic defense or something along those lines. There's so much that can be done for the bigger, more epic fights of the age. However, when it comes to the mundane, everyday dungeon grind or such, the developers are going to be firmly in the driving seat. It's going to be almost impossible to not take creative liberties here. I just hope that the writing, mechanics, and lore that lead to these kinds of dungeons, raids, or story events will be interesting or at least fun to play through. A low effort version of this would be filling a random cave with trolls and calling it a dungeon. A high effort would involve a story, for example, trolls in the area attacking civilians at night, a small quest line that leads, for example, to people asking for help or sending you on a task, then a well-designed dungeon. Maybe the trolls have a leader, maybe they took residence in the cave that leads to a deeper secret that is hidden unknown to the world, or an old temple of more ancient peoples even, and hopefully epic battles or even more things to discover. One of the big things that usually make or break dungeons in MMORPGs are the party systems. Games where there are no set classes that have roles, for example Guild Wars 2, where at the start no one was a healer and no one was really a tank, have some chaotic dungeons that rely on puzzles and small mundane things to be even remotely interesting. Which I definitely found boring, of course. Guild Wars 2 dungeons and raids have come a long way since then, but they never appealed to me then and they don't appeal to me now. Games like World of Warcraft and such use a system of the Holy Trinity, tanks, healers, and DPS classes. The interesting thing to note here is that dungeons that involve the Holy Trinity are usually the most fun to play through, at least in my current experience. Whether they choose to make a chaotic boss like those in Terra that have specific mechanics that the party needs to do while the tank takes the excess damage, or whether they choose to make it more ordered like World of Warcraft where tanks do pulls and try to maximize efficiency while the party wails on the mobs, will be interesting to see. We have no word on whether they will even have classes to choose from or whether the game will revolve around a system similar to New World where the weapon is really what defines the player's playstyle. Honestly, that wouldn't surprise me, but I don't think it would be a great thing when it comes to differentiation between classes and playstyles and appeasing to all MMORPG players of different kinds. I'm excited to see what they can come up with, and I'm super excited to play through the game, all the way to endgame and beyond. I really hope it meets my expectations, but I'm cautiously optimistic about it in the first place. And with that, my free peoples of YouTube, we've come to an end. I hope this video was enjoyable for you as it was for me. I put a lot of work into this video and I do enjoy talking about Tolkien's works and MMORPGs and theories in general. I'll be talking about the game, ideas and theories in more detail on a podcast I'm doing in the near future. I'll let you know when that is. It will be both on YouTube and on my Twitch. Socials for that are in the description down below. With that, I hand it over to you, the viewers, with a few questions. Have I convinced you to play the game at all when it comes out? Is there anything more you'd like to see? What are your thoughts on Tolkien's works coming to life in another MMORPG, this time focusing on a different era? And with that, I thank you for watching. Please feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Once again, links to my socials and Discord are in the description. Any comments, likes, or subscribes do help with the algorithm for sure, so feel free to support me if you enjoyed the content. But let's keep the discussion going and getting our voices and opinions out for Amazon and Athlon to hear. I'd love to hear more from you, and any feedback is highly welcome. And with that, I've been Malicious, and this has been a pleasure.